Welcome to the Republican Professor. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today we're in Loper Bright, The Dissent by Kagan. We're on page 15 of her dissent at 603 in the U.S. Reports, the slip opinion, and we're on page 15 of her dissent. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We're on Roman numeral number 2 is where we left off, and here we go. The majority's principal arguments are in a different vein. Around 80 years after the APA was enacted, that's the Administrative Procedure Act. After the APA was enacted and 40 years after Chevron, the majority has decided that the former precludes the latter. The APA's Section 706, the majority says, makes clear that agency interpretations of statutes are not entitled to deference. But neither the APA nor the pre-APA state of the law does the work the majority claims. Remember, Kagan is writing in dissent here, Loper Bright, this overturned Chevron last year. Remember that? Okay. Both are perfectly compatible with Chevron deference. Section 706, enacted with the rest of the APA in 1946, provides for judicial review of agency action. It states, to the extent necessary to decision and when presented, the reviewing court shall decide all relevant cases, questions of law, interpret constitutional and statutory provisions, and determine the meaning or applicability of the terms of an agency action. That's 5 U.S. Code, Section 706. We're on page 16 now of Kagan's dissent in the slip opinion. That text, contra the majority, does not resolve the Chevron question. Or, said a bit differently, Section 706 is generally indeterminate on the matter of deference. The majority highlights the phrase, decide all relevant questions of law, and notes that the provision prescribes no deferential standard for answering those questions. But just as the provision does not prescribe a deferential standard of review, so too it does not prescribe a de novo standard of review, in which the court starts from scratch without giving deference. In point of fact, Section 706 does not specify any standard of review for construing statutes. And when a court uses a deferential standard, here, by deciding whether an agency reading is reasonable, it just as much decides a relevant question of law as when it uses a de novo standard. The deferring court then conforms to Section 706 by determining whether the agency has stayed within the bounds of its assigned discretion. That is, whether the agency has construed the statute administers reasonably. There's a footnote here. I'll let you look at the footnote if you want. The footnote is about the standard of review prescribed by the statute. I'm not sure why she puts it in a footnote. Why not just put that in the text? But anyway, that's her decision, obviously. We're on page 17. Section 706's references to standards of review in other contexts only further undercut the majority's argument. The majority notes that Section 706 requires deferential review for agency fact-finding and policy making. under, respectively, a substantial evidence standard and an arbitrary and capricious standard. Congress, the majority claims, surely would have articulated a similarly deferential standard applicable to questions of law had it intended to depart from de novo review. Surely? In other part of Section 0706, Congress explicitly referred to de novo review. That's in 702, Section 706, Part 2F. With all those references to standards of review, both deferential and not, running around Section 706, what is telling is the absence of any standard for reviewing an agency's statutory constructions. That silence left the matter, as noted above, generally indeterminate. Section 706 neither mandates nor forbids Chevron-style deference. All right. Hold on one second. I want to double check this footnote, see if it's worth doing. Okay, I'm not going to do the footnote. I'm just going to do her main text here. It's all about standard of review and the authority for standard of review. Okay, we did 17. Now we're on page 18. And contra the majority, most respected commentators understood Section 706 in that way as allowing, even if not requiring, deference. The finest administrative law scholars of the time call them that generation's Manning, Sunstein, and Vermeulen certainly did. Professor Louis Jaffa described something very like the Chevron two-step as the preferred method of reviewing agency interpretations under the APA. A court, he said, first must decide as a question of law whether there is discretion in the premises. That is akin to step one. Did Congress speak to the issue or did it leave openness? And if the latter, Jaffa continued, the agency's view, if reasonable, is free of control. That, of course, looks like step two, defer if reasonable. And just in case that description was too complicated, Jaffa or Jaffe, I'm not sure how to say his name, I guess Jaffe maybe, conveyed his main point this way. The argument that courts must decide all questions of law as if there were no agency in the picture is, in my opinion, unsound. Similarly, Professor Kenneth Culp Davis, author of the then preeminent treatise on administrative law, noted with approval that reasonableness review of agency interpretations, in which courts refused to substitute judgment, had survived the APA. Other contemporaneous scholars and experts agreed. They did not see in their own time what the majority finds there today. We're on page 19. Nor evidently did the Supreme Court. In the years after the APA was enacted, the court never indicated that Section 706 rejected the idea that courts might defer to agency interpretations of law. Indeed, not a single justice so much as floated that view of the APA. To the contrary, the court issued a number of decisions in those years deferring to an agency's statutory interpretation. To be clear, deference in those years was not always given to interpretations that would receive it under Chevron. The practice then was more consistent and less fully elaborated than it later became. The point here is only that the court came nowhere close to accepting the majority's view of the APA. Take the language from 706, section 706, that the majority most relies on. Decide all relevant questions of law. In the decade after the APA's enactment, those words were used only 4 times in Supreme Court decisions, opinions, all in footnotes. Well, that doesn't matter. And never to suggest that courts could not defer to agency interpretations. The majority's view of Section 706 likewise gets no support from how judicial review operated in the years leading up to the APA. That prior history matters. As the majority recognizes, Section 706 was generally understood to restate the present law as to the scope of judicial review. On page 20, the problem for the majority is that in the years preceding the APA, courts became ever more deferential to agencies. New Deal administrative programs had, by that point, come into their own, and this court and others, in a fairly short time, had abandoned their initial resistance and gotten on board. Justice Breyer, wearing his administrative law scholar hat, characterized the pre-APA period this way, quote, judicial review of administrative action was curtailed and particular agency decisions were frequently sustained with judicial obeisance. I don't know how to say that word. Obeisance to the mysteries of administrative expertise. I'm going to have to look that one up. And that description extends to review of an agency's statutory constructions. An influential study of administrative practice, published 5 years before the APA's enactment, described the state of play. Judicial review may, in some instances at least, be limited to the inquiry whether the administrative construction is a permissible one. Or again, where the statute is reasonably susceptible of more than one interpretation, the court may accept that of the administrative body. Well, it says may accept that of the administrative body, but it doesn't say it should or it has to. Page 21. 2 prominent Supreme Court decisions of the 1940s put those principles into action. Gray versus Powell, 1941, was then widely understood as the leading case on review of agency interpretations. There, the court deferred to an agency construction of the term producer as used in a statutory exemption from price controls. Congress, the court explained, had committed the scope of the exemption to the agency because its experience in the field gave promise of a better informed, more equitable adjustment of the conflicting interests. Accordingly, the court concluded that it was not the province of a court to substitute its judgments for the agency's. Let's see here. 3 years later, the court decided NRLB versus Hearst Publications, 1944, another acknowledged leading case. The court again deferred, this time to an agency's construction of the term employee in the National Labor Relations Act. The scope of that term, the court explained, belonged to the agency to answer based on its everyday experience in the administration of the statute. The court therefore limited its review to whether the agency agency's reading had warrant in the record and a reasonable basis in law. Yeah. I would recommend that you look at the footnotes because, they do have some important details. We're on page 22. Recall here that even the majority accepts that Section 706 was meant to restate the present law as to judicial review. Well, then, it sure would seem that the provision allows a deference regime. I'm going to get a drink of water. I'm back. Okay, we're on page 22 at the top. Again, the language of allows versus requires. I'd point that out. The majority has no way around those two noteworthy decisions. It first appears to distinguish between purely legal questions and the so-called mixed questions in Gray and Hurst involving the application of a legal standard to a set of facts. If in drawing that distinction, the majority intends to confine its holding to the pure type of legal issue, uh, thus enabling courts to defer when law and facts are entwined, I'd be glad. But I suspect this is Kagan again. Okay, remember, this is Kagan writing in Dissent and Loper Bright. But I suspect that the majority has no such intent because that approach would preserve Chevron in a substantial part of its current domain. Um, it is frequently in the consideration of mixed questions that the scope of statutory terms is established and their meaning defined. Again, I'm not going into the footnotes. I'm on page 23 at the top. How does a statutory interpreter decide, as in Hurst, what an employee is? In large part through cases asking whether the term covers people performing specific jobs, like, in that case, newsboys. Or consider one of the examples I offered above. How does an interpreter decide when one population segment of a species is distinct from another? Often by considering that requirement with respect to particular species, like western gray squirrels. So the distinction the majority offers makes no real world or even theoretical sense. If the Hearst court was deferring to an agency on whether the term employee covered newsboys, it was deferring to the agency on the scope and meaning of the term employee. I mean, are we assuming that Hearst was rightly decided? Is that what we're assuming? Because the whole point, this is me, the whole point when you're overturning precedent is that stare decisis, while it may be an important value for a number of reasons, isn't enough to keep the precedent in place if it's flawed or if it was wrong to begin with. So, looking at these precedents, it seemed like it would beg the question on this point at least, which is that the arguments against Chevron might equally apply to these precedents. Maybe it's just something to think about as you read this. The issue of the employee. Again, I'm gonna respond and just offer the following thought. If it is so difficult to define the term employee, um, what makes you think that we should be regulating in the first place? I mean, it. All of these examples are examples in which the government gets in there and tries to micromanage private relationships. And you got to ask the question, is that really what the federal government is supposed to be doing? I mean, it sounds like she's kind of making an argument that this is so complicated that the government, because of expertise, can do whatever the hell it wants to do. And the courts have nothing to say about it. In other words, the government is going to do what it's going to do. It really can't legislate on all of these things. It's too complicated. So you're just going to rely on experts to answer these difficult questions for everybody. And those experts are going to be overturned in elections, and the law and meaning of terms is going to bounce back and forth like a racquetball. And then we're just going to have to live with it. And there's nothing that courts can do. I mean, maybe Congress can get in here and start actually defining these terms. And I think the Republicans want that to happen on the Supreme Court. And I think the Republicans on the Supreme Court are saying, Congress, if you can't do that, then stop trying to micromanage everything. I think that's where Loper Bright was originally going. That's my interpretation of it. I'm pretty sure I'm right. Push back to me in the comments if you think I'm wrong. We got a little bit more today, short episode today. We're only going to Roman numeral III today, and then we'll call it quits today. Okay. The majority's next rejoinder that the court was far from consistent in deferring falls equally flat. Hold on. Well, yeah, did I go up through the last paragraph? Yeah. Okay. If the Hearst court was deferring to an agency on whether the term employee covered newsboys, it was deferring to the agency on the scope and meaning of the term employee. Okay. That's just what my comment was about, just using that example. The majority's next rejoinder that the court was far from consistent in deferring falls equally flat. I'm perfectly ready to acknowledge that in the pre-APA period, a deference regime had not yet taken complete hold. Oh, okay. Great. I'm glad to hear that. I'll go even further. Let's assume that deference was then an on again, off again function, as the majority seems to suggest. Even on that assumption, the majority's main argument that Section 706 prohibited deferential review collapses. Once again, the majority agrees that Section 706 was not meant to change the then prevailing law. And even if inconsistent, that law cannot possibly be thought to have prohibited deference. Or, otherwise said, if Section 706 did not change the law of judicial review as we have long recognized, then it did not proscribe a deferential standard then known and in use. The majority's whole argument for overturning Chevron relies on Section 706. But the text of Section 706 does not support that result, and neither does the contemporaneous practice which that text was supposed to reflect. So today's decision has no basis in the only law the majority deems relevant. It is grounded on air. Pretty strong words. She's pulling no punches, and it's a fight, man. This is a fight. It's a fight, 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 fight. The next section goes from page 24 to 31 to Roman numeral IV. And then it's got like just a few pages after that. So I think we'll finish next time. We went about 8 pages today, 9 pages from 15 to 24. And we'll have a little bit longer of an episode when we finish this. We'll have one more episode on Kagan. Then we'll have to get into the majority opinion and the concurrence. I think there's two concurrences, one or two. There's Gorsuch. I'm not sure if Thomas concurs in here. Let me see if I can find a Thomas concurrence. There might be a short Thomas concurrence. I'll take a look, but we'll do, of course, Gorsuch on his own. He's got a substantial concurrence, and that might take a couple of episodes just on Gorsuch, maybe 3. I don't know. But yeah, I think Gorsuch has, well, let's see here, at least 24 page argument for Gorsuch. So actually, it's closer to 36, 30. He's got 33 pages of concurrence or so. So we might have to break that up into 3 different episodes, shorter episodes on Gorsuch. So I think what we'll do is we'll kind of back into the majority's argument, and we'll end up with the majority argument, and that's how we'll leave it. And I want you to see the disagreement within the majority, the concurrence, and I want you to see. I'm talking about the majority on the holding, not the reasoning. And then I'm wanting you to see the disagreement in the dissent, obviously, because that's how we're starting. This is a difficult topic, and it ultimately goes to the separation of powers. It ultimately goes to the proper role of Congress and how we can have the kind of regime that we say we want to have. I'm going to always harp on the American people. We want government to do too much. And when it does too much, a lot of times people just let it do too much. Um, the way Congress is it doesn't legislate like it should. I mean, if you take yourself to be able to regulate everything under the sun, which Congress does, and spend all this money doing it, it seems like that would be far greater a task than they are capable of doing. I mean, if they're going to do it right and they're going to do it well. The issue of expertise, I think, is just naive to think that experts are going to solve these problems. I also think it's naive to think that the experts, when they do solve a problem of ambiguity and the courts are deferential to that, that the political ping pong ball that goes back and forth between elections undermines the rule of law. I think it undermines our ability to have a functioning economy that is healthy because it undermines predictability, which would be a feature of the rule of law. Predictability is undermined because if these terms are ultimately just decided by experts and those can change in an election, um, and you're saying it's an issue of expertise, um, then you're really saying that the law changes based on expertise in elections. Now, you run into a similar issue with if courts are substituting their own policy preferences in deciding these matters, and if they're deciding these matters in such a way that causes problems, that goes against what Congress or the legislature meant, And if you have a legislator that doesn't do anything about that, just lets it be and lets the court take the blame if there's problems, that's dysfunctional too. Ultimately, this goes back to Congress. Congress, can you get together, make decisions, make the kind of compromises that are needed to have law with the required specificity of what you're trying to do, which is legislate anything under the sun? That's great. If you can and it works, that's great. But if you can't, you should just admit it and stop trying to legislate everything. Maybe the administration of the state should go down. Maybe we should spend less money. Maybe we should have private parties decide more of these things on their own. I think that's what the Republicans on the Supreme Court were going for. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. I appreciate it. I just got back from my grandfather's funeral in Ventura County on Friday. It was at Godspeak Calvary Chapel. Pastor Rog McCoy gave the eulogy and also the gravesite service. It was wonderful. I also noticed that Pastor Rob McCoy um, uh, used a lot of his preparation for that eulogy in his sermon on Sunday, which you can find on their YouTube channel at Godspeak Calvary Chapel in Thousand Oaks or Newberry Park. I can't remember which it is. I know he used to be the mayor of Thousand Oaks. But it's quite a good eulogy, and I appreciate Godspeak for hosting that. I know that was my grandfather's church, and he was well loved there. Jim Mather was featured on this podcast. 21 November 2024, which was itself a phone call between Grandpa and me on 7 May 2020. Um, yeah, so we miss James A. Mather, Lieutenant in the United States Navy, World War II veteran. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast.